Assalamualaikum, selamat pagi. Anda menyaksikan Niaga Awani bersama saya Harits Asyraf Hasnan. Sudah tentu untuk waktu ini kita akan terus memberi fokus berkenaan dengan setahun pentadbiran Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim memimpin kerajaan Madani, dan antara laporannya Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim sekali lagi menegaskan pemberian subsidi akan memberi faedah kepada 3.5 juta orang asing dan dimanfaatkan oleh golongan terkaya. Disebabkan kerajaan dan ke inisiatif lain, termasuk pemberian wang tunai kepada rakyat dalam usaha mengurangkan beban kos sara hidup mereka.
Dan kita bincang hampir setiap minggu di Jemaah Menteri. Membincang secara teliti item yang dianggap mengesankan dari sudut kenaikan kos. Saya akui hal ini dan kita boleh redakan sedikit dengan yang dikatakan cash transfer. Bantu tunai lebih baik daripada subsidi. Karena kalau subsidi itu akan memanfaatkan jutaan. Nah, soalannya sama ada B40 M40, jawapannya ialah 10 juta orang. Maknanya mencecah kepada M40. Maknanya faedah yang kita beri melalui suntikan ini seperti yang mula diberikan yang RM100 sebagai test ini.
Yang panas hari ini.
Yang panas sekarang ini. Madani ini. Itu kita akan teruskan. Maknanya kurang-kurangnya 10 juta orang.
Kerajaan mempunyai peranan penting dalam menggubal dasar yang jelas dan bersepadu bagi menarik serta mengekalkan pelabur di Malaysia, kata Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim. Anwar yang juga Menteri Kewangan berkata pendekatan libat urus bersama industri juga perlu diterapkan agar dasar dan inisiatif yang diwujudkan selari dengan keperluan semasa serta masa akan datang.
Perkara tersebut antara yang dikongsikan beliau ketika kunjungan hormat Naib Presiden Dasar Global Persatuan Industri Semikonduktor SIA, Mary Thornton dan delegasinya pada Selasa. Dalam pertemuan ini, ahli-ahli SIA mengambil kesempatan memaklumkan kepada beliau mengenai perancangan industri serta cadangan-cadangan dalam memperkukuh tarikan Malaysia sebagai destinasi pelaburan asing, terutamanya pada peringkat rantaian yang bernilai tinggi. Antara lain, beliau turut menerangkan tentang pendekatan penting kerajaan yang menggalakkan sektor swasta menerajui pusat-pusat kemahiran sebagai langkah mengatasi isu ketidaksepadanan tenaga kerja baru dengan keperluan industri. Selain itu, Anwar juga memaklumkan mereka sependapat bahawa ekosistem perusahaan kecil dan sederhana yang menyumbang kepada rantaian pengeluaran syarikat-syarikat utama dunia perlu sentiasa diberi penekanan dan sokongan. SIA telah menjadi suara industri semikonduktor Amerika Syarikat selama lebih dari 4 dekad. Selain ahli SIA mewakili lebih daripada 99% industri semikonduktor Amerika Syarikat dari segi pendapatan dan hampir 2/3 daripada firma chip bukan Amerika Syarikat.
Pemangku Raja Pahang Tengku Hassanal Ibrahim Alam Shah Al-Sultan Abdullah Riayatuddin Al-Mustafa Billah Shah merupakan antara pemimpin muda yang menyerlah semasa persidangan perubahan iklim Pertubuhan Bangsa-Bangsa Bersatu COP28. Selain melancarkan kempen Pahang Net Zero 2030 pada Sabtu, baginda turut berkongsi pandangan bersama Astro AWANI mengenai langkah kehadapan dalam usaha menangani cabaran perubahan iklim.
It's not easy. Sebab climate change ni kefahaman orang kita, orang rakyat kita ni, we are still in early stages. We need to educate ourselves. We need to change the education program to become more environmental, more ESG. Biar so that the next generation to come they have a better understanding.
Saksikan agenda Awani khas bersama pemangku Raja Pahang Tengku Hassanal Ibrahim Alam Shah Al-Sultan Abdullah Riayatuddin Al-Mustafa Billah Shah pada Rabu 6 Disember 8.30 malam di saluran 501.
Persetujuan untuk menyalur dan menubuhkan dana bagi menangani risiko perubahan iklim semasa persidangan perubahan iklim Pertubuhan Bangsa-Bangsa Bersatu COP28 adalah suatu langkah yang baik. Namun, Timbalan Setiausaha Agung PBB dan Pengarah Eksekutif UN Habitat, Datuk Seri Dr. Maimunah Muhammad Sharif mencadangkan agar diwujudkan mekanisme untuk memantau keberkesanan dana ini di peringkat negara-negara penerima.
Saya juga ingin menyarankan, pertama sekali dana ini disalurkan. Apabila dana ini disalurkan, mesti ada satu mekanisme untuk melihat dan monitor, mengawasi perbelanjaan pelaksanaan dana ini di peringkat local government ataupun dekat negara-negara yang menerima, supaya dana ini dapat dilaksanakan, dapat dibelanjakan kepada perkara-perkara ataupun kepada perkara-perkara dan orang-orang yang sepatutnya menerima bantuan tersebut. I think ini amat penting.
Beliau berkata demikian dalam program Agenda AWANI pada Selasa. Pada masa yang sama, Maimunah menekankan soal kepentingan untuk semua pihak yang melaksanakan agenda hijau berlaku jujur dalam menjayakan resolusi dan kesepakatan bagi menangani perubahan iklim global. Jelasnya tidak wajar pemufakatan yang dicapai hanya sekadar tinggal slogan dan bualan mulut tanpa ada langkah bermakna untuk menterjemahkannya kepada tindakan.
Advanced-Con Holdings Berhad menerusi anak syarikat milik penuhnya Advanced-Con Infra Sdn Berhad telah memperoleh kontrak kerja tanah kedua daripada Samdabi Property pada bulan lalu. Kumpulan itu telah dianugerahkan kontrak RM35.6 juta daripada Samdabi Property Berhad untuk kerja tanah dan kerja bantu di projek perbandarannya di Bandar Bukit Raja peringkat 3 di Klang, Selangor. Nik Rizal Kamil Nik Ibrahim Kamil yang bakal meninggalkan RHB Bank Berhad menjelang akhir bulan ini dijadualkan mengambil alih jawatan Ketua Pegawai Kewangan di Aziata Group Berhad. Pelantikannya akan berkuat kuasa 1 Januari 2024 menurut kenyataan Aziata hari ini. Insan Holdings Berhad dan J-Land Group Sdn Berhad telah memeterai memorandum persefahaman untuk meneroka peluang perniagaan yang berpotensi dalam pembangunan dan penggunaan tenaga boleh diperbaharui dan rumusan teknologi hijau. Kerjasama terbabit memanfaatkan kedudukan Yinsen sebagai syarikat infrastruktur dan teknologi tenaga global dalam perjalanan peralihan inklusifnya serta kedudukan JLG sebagai peneraju dalam perniagaan hartanah dan infrastruktur Johor. Laporan penuh di saluran 501 dan astrawani.com serta dagannews.com.
Elakkan drama dengan Horlicks. Mengandungi zat besi seperti 2 cawan bayam, kalsium seperti segelas susu dan vitamin C seperti 1,5 buah urin. Nutrisi hebat, dap-dap sedap.
Terokai keindahan pulau, tarikan pelancongan dan kehidupan penduduk setempat dalam island checkpoints yang dibawakan khas oleh Tourism Malaysia.
Ada kick dia. Jom kita pergi tengok. Dia main turun je, tak cilah kan? Macam-macam lagi lah. Bau dia.
Ni bubur kuning, boyak garam.
Experience yang baru, kami. Memang cantik.
Setiap Sabtu, 8.30 malam di semua platform Astro Awani.
Dua beradik dibesarkan oleh keluarga angkat penuh konflik.
Ni kosong mahal ni. Tempat aku belajar tu banyak anak orang kaya.
Macam ni ke anak yang enti besarkan selama ni?
Sekarang ni masa kita balas jasa enti dulu.
Mencari jawapan kepada tragedi lalu.
Satu hari saya akan jadi macam Dato'. Angan-angan boleh tapi kena...
Parah ni! Sebabkan dia ni, mak kita tak bersalah tu mati.
Aku janji kita akan dapat keadilan untuk mak.
Jangan lupa janji di Astro Ria dan Astro Go.
Okey, baik, kita bertemu kembali. Kita nak memberi fokus waktu ini berkenaan dengan mikrokredit dan pembangunan modal insan. Bagaimana ianya saling berkait rapat, bagaimana ianya membantu terutamanya kepada perniagaan kecil. Dr. Muhammad Romzi Ibrahim, pensyarah kanan Sekolah Perniagaan dan Ekonomi UPM, bersama dengan saya menerusi Google Meet pada ketika ini. Doktor, terima kasih sudi bersama dengan Astro Awani. Pertamanya, mungkin boleh kongsikan apa mungkin sebenarnya fungsi pembiayaan mikrokredit ini, terutama kepada PMKS. Doktor.
Ya, terima kasih Harits. Sebenarnya mikrokredit ni sebenarnya daripada bila kita tengok perkataan kredit itu ialah merupakan suatu pembiayaan kewangan. Secara khususnya untuk fokus utama dia untuk mengurangkan ataupun pembasmian kemiskinan. Itu tujuan utama sebenarnya mikrokredit facility ini diwujudkan. Ia telah wujud setelah sekian lama, sejak tahun 70-an lagi, selagi saya masih ingat, telah ada dah program mikrokredit ini untuk menolong usahawan specifically yang bukan kecil, bukan sederhana, tapi ini adalah lebih kecil daripada kecil. Itu tujuan utamanya, Haris.
Ya, Doktor, mungkin boleh bantu penonton untuk faham juga. Mungkin dari segi adakah proses pelaksanaan yang sedia ada seiring dengan teras pembangunan negara kalau kita lihat dalam pembiayaan mikrokredit ini?
Ya, kalau kita lihat sepanjang perjalanan negara kita sejak berzaman, sebagai contohnya, kerajaan telah membuka ruang sebenarnya kepada membuka ruang dan peluang sebenarnya untuk pembiayaan mikrokredit tersebut. Kalau kita tengok polisi dasar kerajaan adalah berterusan. Kalau kita tengok setiap tahun pun dalam bajet every year yang kita tengok mesti ada satu peruntukan untuk membantu usahawan-usahawan yang mikro ini. Seperti yang saya katakan tadi, dia bukan kecil tapi ia adalah lebih kecil daripada kecil tadi. So usahawan-usahawan ini perlu kita bantu, dan bantuan yang diberikan yang berpanjangan ini mewujudkan peluang kepada mereka untuk meneruskan perusahaan yang mereka usahakan. Jadi pada pendapat saya, daripada segi dasar, daripada segi polisi, kita telah mewujudkan peluang ini. Tujuan utama tadi untuk merapatkan jurang perbezaan pendapatan dan the ultimate goal dia adalah untuk pembasmian kemiskinan tadi. Ya, Haris.
Dr. Romzi, kalau saya nak bawa perbincangan kita melihat kepada mekanisme, kerana perubahan kalau kita lihat daripada tahun 70-an, 80-an, 90-an sehinggalah terkini ini, banyak perubahan dan juga bantuan dalam bentuk mikrokredit ini ada pelbagai jenis. Dan sekarang ini kalau kita lihat dalam Belanjawan 2024 juga, bantuan mikrokredit itu lebih kepada digitalisasi, bagaimana nak membawa usahawan-usahawan mikro ini menerapkan digitalisasi. Dari segi mekanisme pembiayaan ini, adakah dilihat bersesuaian dengan keperluan semasa, Doktor?
Mengikut apa yang kita lihat yang berlaku sejak sebelum ini sampai sekarang, mekanisme yang disampaikan itu bertepatan, tetapi kita lebih menjuruskan kepada memaksimalkan tahap capaian. Kita pergi ke seluruh pelosok negeri mencari mereka-mereka yang layak untuk menerima pembiayaan mikrokredit ini, dan daripada pendapat saya daripada segi bajet peruntukan yang diperuntukkan, ia telah capai ke target sasaran yang telah ditetapkan. Lagi satu indikator untuk melihat sama ada mekanisme yang diguna pakai ini efektif ataupun tidak, ialah daripada segi satu tadi tahap capaian, daripada bahasa Inggeris ni kita panggil outreach, tahap pencapaian, dan daripada lagi satu indikator adalah depth. Kita capai kepada target sasaran kepada mereka yang miskin dan juga miskin tegar. Tapi zaman telah berubah. So bagi pendapat saya, kalau kita hanya tahap pengukuran capaian ataupun mekanisme yang kita guna pakai ini mungkin perlu ditambah baik, sebab kadar kemiskinan daripada, kalau kita nak bandingkan pada tahun 70-an sampai ke pada hari ini, mungkin kategori tahap kemiskinan yang kita guna pakai pada tahun 70-an mungkin tidak boleh diguna pakai pada masa sekarang, kerana kita lihat tahap kemiskinan ni sekarang kita dah divide dua kategori untuk tahap kemiskinan. Tahap miskin luar bandar, dan mereka yang duduk di bandar, jika kita gunakan aras pengukur sebagai contoh RM1,000 ialah miskin tegar. Sekarang ni rasanya kalau rakyat yang berpendapatan RM1,000 dulu miskin, sekarang ini kalau RM1,000 sekarang adalah miskin tegar. Itu kita punya kategori tahap kemiskinan. So maknanya target sasaran untuk kita outreach kita sudah capai. Tapi sasaran yang seterusnya yang kita perlu revise contohnya adalah berapa indikator yang kita boleh cakap ia adalah target market group yang miskin dan juga miskin tegar sebenarnya.
Ya. Dr. Romzi, kalau kita melihat dari segi effectiveness, doktor juga ada menyebut dari segi keberkesanannya menuju ke hadapan dalam bentuk penambahbaikan. Apa bentuk mungkin penambahbaikan lah yang mungkin boleh dilihat dari segi bantuan mikrokredit ini? Kerana usaha untuk kerajaan untuk menotahkan miskin tegar itu berbaki kurang 1 bulan ini. Itu kalau kita bercakap soal miskin tegar. Miskin seperti yang doktor sebutkan tadi juga, skopnya begitu luas. Pelbagai dimensi kemiskinan itu, miskin pelbagai dimensi itu masih lagi berlaku, pelbagai perkara. Mungkin apa bentuk penambahbaikan dari segi bantuan mikrokredit ini, terutama dalam kita melihat cash aid, bantuan tunai yang disalurkan sama ada kepada individu, isi rumah maupun di peringkat perniagaan usahawan mikro terutamanya, doktor?
Ya, apa yang saya tengok adalah ada beberapa indikator yang selalu saya guna pakai dalam saya punya kajian dan juga daripada segi kajian akademik, yang menunjukkan kita tak boleh hanya menggunakan indikator berapa ramai yang sudah dicapai, berapa miskin dan sebagainya, dan kadar kemiskinan itu perlu dikaji semula untuk menilai kadar tahap kemiskinan yang sebenar-benarnya pada masa sekarang. Daripada segi itu kita juga perlu melihat tentang capacity building sebenarnya. Di sini masuk elemen pembangunan modal insan tersebut, di mana kapasitinya ada, which is kita dah mengeluarkan bantuan daripada segi kewangan. Another area, another angle yang kita boleh tengok adalah daripada segi capability. Capability sama ada penerima bantuan mikrokredit tersebut, adakah mereka mempunyai capability untuk melaksanakan ataupun meneruskan perusahaan yang sedia ada ataupun perusahaan yang akan dilakukan. Di samping itu juga, selain daripada capacity dan juga capabilities tadi, kita juga perlu memastikan penerima bantuan mikrokredit perlu juga mempunyai kompetensi yang secara khusus yang berkenaan ataupun yang berkaitan dengan perusahaan yang mereka ceburi. Kalau tidak, mungkin objektif objektif sebenar yang kita dah set target tadi untuk pembasmian kemiskinan ataupun merapatkan jurang pendapatan tadi mungkin tidak akan tercapai untuk jangka masa panjang. So saya tengok 3 faktor, capacity, capability, kompetensi agak penting di sini supaya kita dapat memastikan mereka yang menerima bantuan ini betul-betul boleh meneruskan perusahaan mereka dan akan mempunyai daya saing yang tinggi.
Baik.
Sebab pada masa ini kita tak ada indikator yang dapat mengukur betul-betul how successful tentang kejayaan sesuatu program mikrokredit tersebut. Contohnya sebagai contohnya saya tengok kita hanya berhenti di setakat berjaya sebagai perusahaan mikro.
Ya.
Indikator seterusnya sepatut kita lihat adalah berapa persen daripada usahawan mikro yang menerima bantuan berjaya digerakkan kepada perusahaan kecil dan sederhana. Next indicator, next level, kita boleh tengok daripada kecil dan sederhana kepada syarikat seni berhad kepada syarikat berhad mungkin. Dengan ada indikator yang konkret sebegini, mungkin tahap kecapaian, tahap kejayaan itu akan lebih impactful ya, Haris.
Ya, sudah tentu banyak usaha lagi boleh dilakukan dan juga penambahbaikan dalam kita nak memastikan usaha menotahkan kemiskinan dan juga memperkasa usahawan-usahawan terutama mikro naik daripada mikro, kecil, sederhana dan terus berkembang dapat dilaksanakan. Terima kasih Dr. Muhammad Romzi Ibrahim, Pensyarah Kanan Sekolah Perniagaan dan Ekonomi UPM. Segalanya akan kami rangkumkan di astroawani.com dan juga di semua platform media sosial kami. Dan saya nak ke laporan seterusnya di mana jumlah kargo udara untuk syarikat penerbangan Asia Pasifik naik 7.6% pada Oktober 2023 berbanding bulan yang sama pada 2022. Ia selepas syarikat penerbangan di rantau ini mendapat manfaat daripada pertumbuhan berterusan dalam kargo tan bagi setiap kilometer atau CTK antarabangsa di 3 laluan perdagangan utama.
Persatuan Pengangkutan Udara Antarabangsa IATA mengeluarkan data untuk pasaran kargo udara global pada Oktober 2023 menunjukkan bulan ketiga berturut-turut pertumbuhan tahun ke tahun dengan permintaan global CTK meningkat sebanyak 3.8% pada Oktober 2023 berbanding Oktober 2022. Menurut IATA dalam kenyataan, 3 laluan perdagangan utama dengan pertumbuhan CTK tertinggi ialah Afrika Asia dengan 16.7%, pertumbuhan tahunan tertinggi sejak Mei, Timur Tengah Asia 10.3% dan Eropah Asia 8.5%. Kapasiti yang boleh didapati untuk syarikat penerbangan di rantau ini meningkat sebanyak 30% berbanding Oktober 2022. Ketua Pengarah IATA Willie Walsh berkata, pertumbuhan yang lebih kukuh meletakkan kargo udara di landasan untuk mengakhiri 2023 dengan lebih kukuh daripada permulaan tahun ini. Beliau berkata permintaan yang pulih, hasil yang kukuh dan perdagangan yang meningkat adalah berita baik. Bagaimanapun dengan permintaan yang masih 2.4% di bawah paras sebelum pandemik dan ketidakpastian mengenai trajektori ekonomi global, keyakinan perlu diimbangi dengan berhati-hati.
E-dagang dan pemasaran secara digital tidak asing lagi dalam dunia usahawan seluruh negara. Sifatnya yang lebih efisien, fleksibel, relevan serta sangat menguntungkan dalam meningkatkan jualan dan memperluaskan jajahan pasaran tidak boleh disangkal. Malah ianya turut menjimatkan kos sesebuah syarikat dalam pelbagai segi, misalnya sewaan kedai. Bagi pemilik Finders Keepers Collection, Win Eng, platform media sosial banyak memberi impak besar positif terhadap imej perniagaannya.
Beg batik buatan tangan rekaan khas yang setiapnya membawa ciri tersendiri, kini mempunyai rangkaian pelanggan yang lebih meluas. Ini kerana terdapat pertambahan jumlah pengikut dalam setiap platform media sosial Finders Keepers Collection. Kemahiran Win Eng dalam pembuatan beg serta kecintaannya terhadap seni tradisional batik menjadi titik permulaan penciptaan beg unik berasaskan kain batik. Win berkata, rekaan yang menarik adalah kunci untuk menjadikan sesuatu beg batik itu laris dalam pasaran e-dagang. Dan setiap kali ada rekaan baru, Win Eng akan menyiarkannya secara rasmi di platform media sosial dan laman sesawang syarikatnya.
Selepas PKP dah start market, sudah ada boleh buat event, tapi I punya Facebook, Instagram still ada lagi online, still continue lagi. So still ada customer bila saya ada gambar yang baru, produk yang baru, dia orang beli barang yang terbaru dari online. Kalau nak tunggu di event, nak tengok produk, kena tunggu ada event baru dia boleh dapat. Tapi kalau dari Instagram, Facebook, dan bila saya buat hari ini, I post dan dia orang boleh beli hari ini yang terbaru. So sambutan dari Instagram lebih baik, lebih sesuai. Pasal itu customer follower, dia orang tak tahu kualiti barangan saya. Saya selalu pasarkan produk saya di online, Facebook, Instagram, and then masa PKP saya buatkan produk yang terbaru, saya promotekan di Instagram, saya tunjukkan customer apa yang saya buat, barang yang terbaru, desain yang terbaru, batik yang terbaru yang saya buat. So dia akan support saya, dia orang beli, dia continue dia order dengan saya.
Setiap beg Finders Keepers Collection adalah 100% buatan tangan dan hanya direka untuk satu. Pelanggan tidak akan dapat mencari beg, rekaan dan warna batik yang sama di dunia. Finders Keepers Collection sudah menampak dalam industri seni pembuatan ini sejak 10 tahun lalu dan berharap menerusi e-dagang, jenama syarikatnya akan membawa beg batik yang mempunyai identiti Malaysia ke mata dunia.
Sekuriti makanan dan perubahan iklim saling berkait rapat. Ia meliputi sistem rantaian makanan termasuk pengeluaran, pemprosesan, pengedaran dan penggunaan serta hubung kait dengan sekuriti makanan dan mitigasi perubahan iklim ke arah makanan yang sihat dan selamat di masa akan datang. Ikuti temu bual editor Astro AWANI Zulfitri Yusof seiring penganjuran COP28 di Dubai, UAE.
Kita sering bincangkan isu mengenai keselamatan makanan dan juga bagaimana golongan petani khususnya diberikan praktis yang terbaik dan juga mampu menjana pendapatan mereka sendiri. Tapi itu yang dibincangkan perkara asas khususnya kita di Malaysia, tapi ada perkara yang lebih besar untuk kita lihat dan juga bagaimana inisiatif ini dapat digerakkan dengan partisipasi dan juga kepercayaan syarikat-syarikat besar. Dan di WEF mereka ada kepakaran, ada cara untuk menghubungkan antara korporat-korporat besar bersama dengan petani dan sebagainya yang digelar sebagai First Movers Coalition for Food, dan saya bersama dengan Ketua Makanan dan juga Air di WEF, Head of Water and Food at WEF, Tanya Strauss. Thank you for being with us at COP28. We mentioned about the food security, and then you talk, perhaps you can just give the overview of the First Movers Coalition for Food. How behind the idea, and then how do we think that the real problem on the ground?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and also congratulations to the COP28 presidency here in the United Arab Emirates, who has convened over 130 countries, including Malaysia, around the Emirates Declaration for Sustainable and Resilient Food Systems. And this political commitment that looks at the role of food systems as a square, central, pivotal lever for climate action, both mitigation and adaptation, is a landmark opportunity for the rest of us to respond with a similar confidence signal. The First Movers Coalition for Food is looking at the market demand that is not currently defined for sustainable practices to be adopted. You have to remember that at the core of the food system are over 600 million smallholder farmers. In Southeast Asia, this is the backbone of the food production systems. And the First Movers Coalition for Food will look at multiple commodities that right now could be transferred from the highest emitters to the best outcomes, both in terms of carbon and emissions, but also in terms of resilient livelihoods, which means incomes and money in the farmers' pockets, as well as water, the whole ecosystem. In Southeast Asia, for example, if you think about the role of rice, this is a major commodity across multiple countries. But as I said, it's the smallholder farmers who have to take on the risk of embarking on these transitions. So the First Movers Coalition brings together all of the corporate and research partners that can help actually purchase those products and give signals of confidence to those farming communities that there is a marketplace. These are, after all, economic agents. The private sector is defined as multinationals, regionals, but also the SMEs and the smallholders who are all looking at those economic incentives.
How it can be addressed, because every single country and continent, perhaps, having this different ecosystem and different political system as well, and how you tap to every single level, for instance.
No, absolutely. I think the movement and the political will at the global stage is very important, but food and water are issues that are quite local. And you have to understand what is important, not just in the political, economic, and societal, but the cultural values of food. And I know I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, and this is essential around this. So I think when you start to layer on the benefits of livelihoods, of healthy diets, of jobs in the future and the next generation of farming, all of a sudden, like you said, that grounds us in the realities of what we need to change and how we are producing our food today. And this initiative is looking at the purchasers, the retail players, the traders along the value chain that hold significant purchasing power. And they have to support our farmers and our consumers to help make these transitions, because ultimately it will be people who will change. And so that's why the focus is on that.
How we define the low carbon emission if we relate it to the food production? Because sometimes it's quite alien for the mass market, because perhaps people will have a perception that's being crucified by a certain group of people. Perhaps you can explain more about that.
I mean, if I come back to the example of rice, right now in countries like Vietnam, where the Prime Minister here in COP28 yesterday made a very bold announcement around 1 million hectares of low-carbon, high-quality rice in Vietnam. Why does that matter? It's not just about the production of rice. These farmers have the opportunity to be at the nexus of food, water, and energy. saving on the kinds of practices that will help with water retention. So you're reducing the cost of the use of water by reducing the cost of energy to move that water around those paddy fields, right? So you're actually tackling it from a number of different elements, and it's not just a carbon conversation. And we're not necessarily going into the ether of what carbon alone can do. This is really a more holistic perspective at how something like low emissions rice can drive multiple co-benefits.
How are you bridging the gap between one country to another? Because that's the main problem, the main challenge in the global issue.
I think what's common across the different geographies is that they hold this challenge of financing the transition. And so a market signal is really important in the context of, like I said, instilling confidence. I think those local solutions end up being very specific to the community you're in, the country you're in, the commodity you're working on. And that diversification is a good thing because that's where innovation will come from, and those solutions can come from all over the value chain, including the farmers themselves.
How do you measure the success of this initiative? There must be a framework or benchmark or
Yes, so I would say I would measure it in two ways.
Okay.
One, in a very economic sense, to say we have committed that these companies and the research partners in the countries will mobilize anywhere from $10 to $20 billion of green procurement in the next 7 years to 2030.
That's quite realistic?
That is realistic because right now the coalition announced here at COP28 yesterday already represents the corporate purchasing power of $2.1 trillion. So, okay, this is a drop in the bucket and we need to contribute to it and we have to move on that. The second metric for success for us and me personally is that the farmers instill trust in these. The trust is breaking down around the world for a number of reasons, and we all know that. If this can help instill that confidence so that they know that folks around the world are working side by side and that trust can be translated into impact, then we are having success.
How do you want to work with the trust? Because there's going to take long time compared to get the funding.
Let me give you an example, okay? So if we're thinking coming back to Thailand and Vietnam, where rice farmers are looking at the way they have to produce must change, but how can they do it? Who do they work with and why would they do it? For example, I don't think this is a silver bullet. This has to work in tandem with a lot of the other initiatives, policy, financing, and the farmers themselves to say we have to take this holistic approach. But if this lever instills that confidence and builds that trust, and the farmers undergo that transition, that's how we will know that it worked. I don't think it'll take as long as you think.
Okay, there's any plan from Malaysia, perhaps, for this kind of initiative?
Absolutely. We welcome Malaysia as a partner, both to co-develop the activities as well as the corporate sector of Malaysia to join in terms of the procurement discussions. So welcome the future collaboration.
Okay, cool. We just bridging the idea and the initiative. Thank you, Tanya. Kami menghubungkan mungkin anda dan juga masyarakat kat Malaysia mungkin boleh mengambil kira inisiatif ini, dan juga ini perkongsian kami, percabaran idea dan juga perkongsian maklumat yang kami bawakan dari COP28. Terus saja bersama rakan tugas di studio.
You know I like you, right? You exploded.
Dialah cinta yang dicari.
I baru confirm my feelings. I rasa macam dah jatuh cinta.
Bolehkah dia menjadi segalanya?
Serius lah, dah accept arranged marriage. Dan bila aku pandang dia, aku yang nampak arah syurga aku.
And I kinda like what I see.
Kau nak tahu kan saya? Supaya saya boleh jadi isteri yang lebih baik untuk awak. Boleh bahagiakan awak.
Syurga itu bukan mudah. Isnin hingga Khamis, 10 malam. Di Astro dan On Demand.
Hai, mini love for you. Mini love for you. Big love for you. Sarah, hey. I got tips-tips ini dari K-drama di Astro Go. Semua pun boleh belajar. Astro Go free tau.
Welcome back to AWANI. At this hour, we're going to shift our discussion towards the topic of healthcare, focusing on cancer care challenges, gaps and opportunities in Malaysia. According to a study by the Gallen Centre for Health and Social Policy, cancer survival rates in Malaysia are below the desired levels, with a 61% mortality to incidence ratio higher than comparable countries. Breast cancer, for instance, has a concerning 5-year survival rate of 67%, and lung cancer is at 11%, resulting in a higher number of deaths. Late-stage diagnosis, accounting for 64% of cases, emphasize the need for improved access to effective treatment. While Malaysia has a lower incidence of new cancer cases, addressing late-stage diagnosis and enhancing disease management is crucial for improving survival rates. So, joining me on the line right now is Raman Singh, the CEO of Juniper Biologics. Good morning, Raman.
Good morning.
All right, great. Can you start off by introducing Juniper Biologics and what do you do?
Sure. Well, Juniper Biologics is a biotech pharmaceutical company. We are in the therapeutic areas of oncology, which is cancer care, which you started the discussion with. Apart from that, we are into gene therapy, into rare diseases, and into infectious diseases.
So what motivated Juniper Biologics to focus on specific therapy areas, and how does Juniper Biologics envision to fill in the unmet needs in these areas?
Yeah, well, Juniper Biologics, the genesis of Juniper Biologics has been that I actually in 2020 saw that there was no pharmaceutical biotech company that was focusing on emerging markets. You have a number of global companies, you have a number of domestic companies like Korean companies, Chinese companies, Japanese and Indian companies, but pan-Asian, pan-Middle East, pan-Australia, we don't see much. So that prompted me to start Juniper Biologics, and our focus has been primarily on disease areas where there is a significant unmet need. So oncology was one such space. And that's how cancer care became extremely important to us. And we started the company by acquiring 3 assets in the area of oncology, and subsequently diversified into gene therapy, into rare diseases. And today I have almost 7 products in our product portfolio.
So speaking of which, as oncology and oncology supportive care are a part of Juniper Biologics' focus areas, so what are some of the existing gaps or challenges in cancer care, especially in Malaysia?
I think one of the biggest challenges in Malaysia is diagnostic. In fact, by the times we identify the patients in Malaysia, it's significantly late. It's typically a stage 3 or stage 4 cancer. And if you look at Malaysia, some of the leading cancer care in Malaysia, or cancers that are prevalent in Malaysia, are breast cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, and by the time the patients present themselves, they are in a state where they actually have a limited number of years before which the cancer would take a lethal turn, or would find themselves in a situation where they need access to care which is significantly innovative drugs which are not available in markets like Malaysia. Typically, these drugs are extremely expensive, and the public hospitals in Malaysia don't cater to such drugs. So those are the 2 significant challenges that are prevalent in Malaysia.
So how is this cancer drug shortage and inaccessibility to novel therapies in Malaysia posing a problem for both patients and medical professionals, and how frequent are these problems now?
So typically, if you see, just to give you an example, if 100 new drugs as approved by Food and Drug Administration in the US are available in Western world, only 15 of such drugs are available in markets like Malaysia. Typically, the problem has been that, 1, the regulatory environment is quite complex. Secondly, the pricing of these drugs make it very, very difficult for patients to have an access to these drugs. And thirdly, because the public hospital systems are quite constrained, there are a lot of limitations in number of beds available, number of healthcare providers available. Hence, the focus of these hospitals are more on prevalent cancers like breast or lung, And typically the rare cancers are deprioritized because they just don't have the time or the resources to take care of it.
And while overcoming cancer remains challenging and involves a complex journey from diagnosis to survivorship, often spanning months to years. So what are some of the solutions in oncology and oncology supportive care currently available in the Malaysia market, and how is Juniper Biologics filling in the existing gaps?
So I think we as a company have taken the diagnostic testing as a part of our portfolio. So we actually have products that are from diagnostics till treatment. And we believe by combining the two, it facilitates not only in terms of early diagnostics, but also then making sure that the right medication is administered to the patients. And that's why the diagnostic becomes extremely important, because it not only helps to figure out the kind of cancer that the patient is suffering, but also it helps us to determine which therapies and which drugs would actually work for that patient and which would not. And hence, what we are trying to do is we are trying to make sure that we start with testing, we kind of detail the results to the patients and healthcare providers, and then have the appropriate medication that is made available to the patient so that they can get treated.
Raman, can you elaborate more on molecular profiling and how can Caris molecular profiling address drug shortages and lack of personalized therapeutics, and also thereby improve patients' quality of life?
Caris molecular profiling is quite a game changer. In fact, in the United States alone, if you compare on diagnostic testing, Caris has got a market share of over 60%, by far is a market leader. It's the most comprehensive tumor profiling diagnostic test that's available. Just for the sake of simplicity, when a patient presents themselves to a hospital or to a healthcare provider, before a medication gets prescribed, a tumor profiling is done to ensuring that the DNA sequencing of the patient is formulated, and we determine the drugs that will actually work for that patient and the drugs which will not work. Hence, it actually kind of initiates a personalized care that the drugs that are prescribed to the patients are the drugs that actually would generate results, which would significantly impact the quality of life of patients.
So moving forward, are there any other expected opportunities and trends in oncology and oncology supportive care in this market in the upcoming year 2024?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of supportive care, Juniper is bringing a product called anamorelin, which is chemotherapy-induced cachexia. That means patients who are actually doing chemotherapy, weight loss is a big side effect. So we are bringing a drug which will actually take care of appetite so that appetite does not get suppressed. We are also bringing forward a drug for cancer, which is a rare disease, which a number of patients that impacted are fairly small, but patients have no choice. So we are looking forward to even bringing that drug next year to the Malaysian market. And we are also then working towards gene therapy, which is for osteoarthritis of the knee. So there is a significant pipeline that Juniper is currently working on.
But Raymond, are there any relevant business updates or projects in the pipeline for Juniper Biologics? And what are some of the goals set for 2024 that Juniper Biologics intends to achieve?
So one of the key initiatives that we have taken in Malaysia is to make sure that our drugs are available not only in private hospitals, but also in public hospitals. We know that 3 out of 4 patients in Malaysia actually go to public hospitals, and Juniper as a company has created a strategy where market access has become a significant importance to us, that we want to price the drug that is more affordable so that the public hospitals can get access to innovative care that we have. Both Caris as well as some of our oncology drugs, we are making sure that we go through the Blue Book listing, which will basically bring the access to care to public hospitals.
All right, thank you so much, Raman. That was Raman Singh, the CEO of Juniper Biologics, for helping us understand more on how we can advance our cancer care with precision, deliver targeted treatments for enhanced efficacy in Malaysian oncology solutions. Thank you so much.
You know I like you, right? You exploded.
Dialah cinta yang dicari.
I baru confirm my feelings. I rasa macam dah jatuh cinta.
Bolehkah dia menjadi segalanya?
Serius lah, nak accept arranged marriage. Bila aku pandang dia, aku yang nampak arah syurga aku.
And I kinda like what I see.
Kau tahu kan saya, supaya saya boleh jadi isteri yang lebih baik untuk awak. Boleh bahagiakan awak.
Syurga itu bukan mudah. Isnin hingga Khamis, 10 malam di Astro dan On Demand.
So maybe without further ado, we'll start, if I may, with Satpal. And if you could possibly both introduce yourself a little bit more, but also talk about why adaptation resilience is so important for the organisation that you work for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamin. So my name is Satpal. I work with Plus Malaysia. So some of you who are familiar with Malaysia, it is Southeast Asia's largest highway. We have about 5,000 kilometers of pavement, and it connects the borders of Singapore to Thailand, right? It passes over 7 states. We have about 1.7 million people who use our highway every day, and about 60% of Malaysia's GDP passes through the highway, right? Originally, when the highway was built, it was a catalyst to be able to drive economic activity, and the highway has helped create little cities, industrial hubs, and housings right across, right? What is really important, or why we find resilience being very important for us, is we want to facilitate economic activity. And we want to make sure that everyone who uses a highway has a safe and efficient movement, right? So I want to share one of the key things we recently did was we did a climate risk assessment. Now, very important exercise to be able to identify a couple of things. Learning from what has been done before, then superseding that with some of the climate models and getting an integrated picture. Now, this was very important for us, not only to keep our people safe, not only to keep people who use the highway safe, but also the communities that live around it. So the model was very specific. You'll be able to identify climate hazards, such as riverine flooding, rainfall, soil erosion, up to 1 kilometer. So that was interesting for us to do. We identified 30 hotspots in Malaysia. And obviously, if any of you have time, I can sit down and discuss with you what these 30 hotspots are. We wanted to go down and make sure that the infrastructure in place is ready. So we have 8,000 drains and culverts, 6,000 slopes, 715 bridges, and to make sure that all of these are ready, infrastructure is ready enough to make sure we can, be resilient towards floods, soil erosions, and slopes. So some of the interesting things that we have done. Thank you, Shamin.
Thank you so much. If the roadways are not adapted, I think there'll be some problems for the country.
Yeah.
And maybe if I could move on to you, Dr. Hafiz, and you could again explain your role and why adaptation is so important.
Hello, Tess. Shamin, BCG team, thanks a lot for having us here on the panel. It's a pleasure to be among such distinguished speakers here. So Khazanah is the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia with an AUM of about 25 billion US dollars. We invest both across the public and also the private sector, operates across different areas such as Malaysia, China, India, Turkey, and the United States, right? And my role is to lead sustainable investments within Khazanah. And this covers 2 main portions within climate, which is to set an equitable net zero pathway and also to ensure resilience of our portfolio against climate change, right? So on sustainability, we're committed to net zero emissions by 2050 and also carbon neutral by 2023, and that's already completed. Now, coming back to your question to why, right? I actually really appreciate starting with that question because oftentimes work is done for the sake of doing it, right? We don't really understand the why. And we do acknowledge that net zero is important and we're doing our best to help Malaysia reach our NDCs. But at the same time, it's important to remember the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, right? And the reason is that, from a climate justice perspective, the total historical emissions, as we know, by the top 3 countries, US, China, and Russia, is about 46%, but Malaysia has only contributed to the minister's point of 0.6%, right? That and the temperature increase projection of about 3.2 degrees Celsius based on IPCC by 2100, and also recently we found out as the part of the global stocktake that we're on a trajectory of 2.4 to 2.6 degrees Celsius, right? And so we're exposed to all these physical risks, and adaptation resilience is really critical to ensure that we are safe as a nation. Now, Khazanah has a dual mandate, which is to deliver sustainable value for Malaysians by, first of all, increasing economic competitiveness and strength, and second, to build socio-economic resilience and sustainability. Now, from an economic standpoint, Malaysia is a rich and vibrant economy, right? But climate hazards will be actually impacting some of our industries, specifically the financial sector, transportation, health, and utilities. And Khazanah has large holdings within some of the companies within these industries, right? So given our dual mandate, we're actually very much concentrated within Malaysia. And that means we're exposed to all these physical risks. And this is because really we don't have enough data to measure some of these impacts, right? And so the end goal is really to build resilience across our portfolio, which includes, the supply chain resilience, right? And if we look at the case study, Port Klang, which is our main port, will actually be drowned by 2100, right? So what do we do about it is the question here. From a societal standpoint, coming back to my dual mandate that I mentioned earlier, there will be communities impacted by climate change, right? Coastal communities constitute about 1/3 of the population in high-density states such as Selangor and KL. So most of the communities are actually underserved, and 90% of them are actually B40 households, right? And with the projected, flood will be projecting to have a property loss of about 3.2 billion ringgit, and heat stress is going to have a major impact on different sectors. And, the severity of these events will actually get worse because of climate change, right? So coming back to your question as why adaptation and resilience is important, really is because our mandate is to safeguard Malaysia's economy and protect the rakyat of Malaysia. And rakyat in this sense is the Malay word for society. Sorry, that's a long answer, but that's essentially where we stand.
I think it's so important to think about it not just as being an economic reason to do these things, that there's a social reason. And putting a value on that is almost impossible. But increasingly we have to think about that as we try and justify investments in adaptation, which is a theme we'll come on to. But Jean, the World Bank sees this from, across the world, but obviously Malaysia within that context. But perhaps you could explain from a Malaysia point of view why adaptation matters for the World Bank.
Oh, I take this one. Okay. Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation, and really congratulations to Malaysia for organizing this discussion. I was very lucky to be invited last year at another discussion in the Malaysian pavilion, and we had a great discussion, so really appreciate it. So my name is Jean Pem. I'm the Global Director for Finance at the World Bank, so covering all issues financial sector. And when it comes to climate finance, what can and is the contribution of the financial sector to climate finance more generally? And we have a really great partnership through hub of the bank with Bank Negara Malaysia. So we have a lot of work on this financial sector issue with Malaysia. It's a great opportunity to showcase that during this discussion. So adaptation and resilience is really a top priority for the bank. You may have seen from the transformation of the bank, the roadmap of the bank, that actually there is even more emphasis on these issues in the new agenda. So some of it with innovation, such as what has been announced and reaffirmed and pushed forward this week on debt clauses, for instance, in our own loans, but also other work that is being done on contingent finance to be able to be even more reactive than used to be the case. So why? Because it's a critical agenda from a development perspective, and also when you think about it from a resilience perspective, because when shocks happen, the most affected are the poorest, the most vulnerable, so women, local community, poor household, but also MSMEs, which are really what constitute economic development in the country. So that's why it's so important. So I know you said at the start we don't need to have numbers, but just one to show a little bit what's happening. So over the first 6 months of the year, the global community saw overall losses of $110 billion due to natural disaster. This is 12% more than the equivalent period of last year. So that has really an economic impact, and this is why it's so important to increase preparedness. So maybe let me start with resilience and what we call financial resilience to natural disaster, which is one of the elements on which we've been working for quite some time through our disaster risk finance. And we are now expanding that more generally to climate risk-related elements. So part of it is to better understand the risk, and we'll come back to that during the discussion, and then in as much as possible to improve financial preparedness, so that when crisis hit, then there is an immediate response, including by providing financing to those affected, and at the same time developing domestic insurance market, which is one of the challenge and things where Indonesia can continue to do that. So for that, we are working directly at the bank, but also mobilizing partnerships. So one of the examples, and this is something that was launched last year at COP27, is the Global Sheet Facility, which is a way to bring partnership and mobilize financing, and not just public financing, which is an important element of that discussion. So 3 objectives. So partnership to enable increased financial capacity and not just public resources, putting financial resources, private sector investment, and international assistance. That's the first element. Second, risk sharing and risk transfer mechanism. Not all of this, you can have layers of intervention where you go to the domestic market and then to the capital market, including with reinsurance, and by risk pooling, you also better mutualize the risk. So this is also an important element. And then finally, coordination. You see a lot of players in financial protection, and the more coordinating there are and the more risks are shared, the more effective you are. So this is really something that we are doing. Starting to do with Malaysia, we'll be very keen to do more, but as you mentioned earlier, Philippines is a good example of this. Now, it's not just about financial protection, it's also about facilitating the adaptation at all levels. So, and we know that the biggest gap in terms of climate finance is at the moment on adaptation. So there is a big focus on mitigation. Even there, we have a huge financing gap. We need to mobilize the private sector even more, and that's even more the case when it comes to adaptation. So we can discuss some specific example of how we do it. But one of the fundamental aspects of our priorities for us is really to completely embed climate risk into the financial sector as a way to have better recognition of the risk. That's also how you create opportunity and channel funding. We do that by assisting on financial regulation, but also by helping in the development of standard and market transparency so that funds are better channeled to where they will be more important. So that's that link from risk to opportunity, which we think is really important.
Thank you, Jean. Such a comprehensive picture of the financial perspective, both from all angles. And we're going to come back to it, particularly around the angle of financing adaptation to avoid those absolutely huge numbers. Numbers are always helpful, and they're as simple as the one that you put forward there. Anjali, please, over to you.
So is the question still about why adaptation is important? Yes. So hi, everyone. Really great to be here at the Malaysia Pavilion to talk about adaptation, which I think has been a real focus at COP this year, to hear so many sort of different communities and stakeholders talk about adaptation. And it's really great to sort of discuss this in the Malaysia context, right after Minister Nazmi spoke so well about it and about Malaysia's plans and ambitions about that. So I'm Anjali Vishwamohanan. I'm Director of Policy with the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. So the AIGCC is an investor network that brings together over 70 investors, both asset owners and asset managers, that represent over 32 trillion USD in assets globally. And we sort of work with these investors in facilitating understanding of climate-related risks and opportunities, and we work with them on sort of building plans, on setting targets, engaging with their companies, thinking about investments, and engaging with policymakers to facilitate more cohesive action on climate. So why adaptation and resilience is important to the organization is because I'd just like to sort of quote a study that AIGCC started before COP began this year. So we sort of did an analysis of 182 investors that operate in Asia to understand how investors are sort of thinking about climate-related risks and opportunities. And out of these 182 investors, we see that 116 investors have prioritize the integration of sort of climate-related risks and opportunities in the way that they're going forward. And these investors represent over 26 trillion USD in assets. So you're clearly seeing that, you know, there is a definite demand and a view in the way that investors are thinking about climate. And you cannot think about climate in isolation of the physical climate risks, which is just so prevalent in Asia, right? So at AIGCC, we engage with our investors on sort of capacity building to understand how investors can actually assess at a portfolio level the exposure of their companies to physical climate risks, like Hafiz mentioned. We also encourage investors to sort of engage with their companies to understand how these companies are building resilience plans and how they plan to sort of finance them and engage on these plans more actively. But I think a more important conversation that will bring all of these elements together is to sort of have a plan at a national level in different governments. I think, like Minister Nazmi said, like having a national adaptation plan is, I think, one of the fundamental components that investors are sort of advocating for to facilitate more action at a company level, at a investor level, at a community level, and sort of a way to bring all stakeholders together to understand what the government plan is on adaptation. If you look at the national adaptation planning process itself, you will see that it is a very comprehensive process that helps countries think about what are the sort of risks that it is being exposed to when you do a level of analysis on the type of climate-related impacts that it has. So you have an understanding of the type of risks, and then you work with the different stakeholders to understand the type of projects that's required over a short-term, medium-term, and long-term to guard against these risks. And what's really interesting about this process is it's not just a document that you put out there at sort of like one point. It's something that you sort of, you know, you put out there, you learn from what you implement, and all of these data systems, the science behind it keeps getting updated. So it is a process that needs to sort of keep getting revised, updated based on feedback, and that loop is really essential. And bringing all of the stakeholders, such as companies, investors, stakeholders, into that process is very integral. And so at AIGCC, one way we see to sort of get investors to act more is to understand how different countries are performing on adaptation plans. So at AIGCC, we're developing a research to understand how national adaptation plans in different countries in Asia are performing against investor expectation metrics on national adaptation plans, which is coming up very soon. And one of the gaps that we saw, especially in Malaysia, was that, you know, we didn't have a comprehensive adaptation plan, and it was really encouraging to see that at the start of this session, Minister Nazmi said that is going to be a priority for the Malaysian government. And I think that's going to be a very crucial step forward in enabling all of these actors on the stage and everywhere, you know, at COP to do more in Malaysia on adaptation.
Thank you, Anjali, and I'm pleased you brought up the national adaptation planning process. It's something we're involved with a lot, and as you say, what's so important is you understand the impact of different climate events and how that's likely to play out going forwards. You turn that into what are the necessary, and by the way, you come back to the social and economic impact of those, which helps you then define what are the projects that you need to put in place in order to address some of these issues. And that, of course, is a way to bring private sector as well as public sector, etc., into the game to start investing and create some action. I'd say there are not many countries that have got very far down that route yet.
Can I just add something there?
Please.
So I think what we are seeing is also that, you know, countries that have implemented national adaptation plans have shown how they're able to facilitate more stakeholder action on adaptation. So I can bring a few examples in here. So for example, if you look at Korea, their adaptation plan was announced in 2012. And since the announcement of their plan, they've sort of mobilized a lot of action from the company side and sort of thinking and innovating solutions that will help in building resilience for communities. I'd just like to highlight one example of K-Water. So K-Water is a public utilities company that's essential to sort of look at the service of providing water for companies, private sector, individuals in whole of Korea. So what they've done over a period of time is they've sort of developed resilience measures for water supply that could sort of protect all of the companies that's operating in Korea, but they're also looking at companies outside and providing resilience as a service because they've sort of innovated over time. And all of this has come because there is sort of like a government focus on adaptation and the prioritizing of the type of risks that will affect different markets. And another example is sort of Japan. So Japan also has a good adaptation plan, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring that to a local level. So what that helps with is that when there are companies at a local level that's looking at building out resilience plans, they're able to integrate that at a local level with what the local planning on adaptation is. So you're sort of able to bring all of this to a systemic view on adaptation and implementation, right? So I think there are many examples of why this would work, and so it's really fantastic to sort of see that Malaysia is also going down the same path.
Thank you, Anjali. You've already answered a question we had coming up later, was what can we learn from other countries? But those are fantastic examples. We're going to just step back one step and talk about actually the challenges today for Malaysia as a country in moving forward on adaptation. There isn't yet the National Adaptation Plan. We aren't yet at the stage that you talked about. And I know that Satpal and then afterwards Dr. Hafiz, you have some quite clear ideas as to where you think there are issues and what we need to change, some of the challenges we need to address.
Absolutely, Charmaine. Thanks for sharing that. So what we have realized as part of the climate studies, right, is the severity of rainfall and the frequency has increased. While that's in place, the areas with the highest hotspots are the urban areas. And why? Number one, there's been deforestation, which has caused soil to soften and has caused landslides. Number two, development has been occurred in areas where there's peat soil. So by right, there shouldn't be development in these areas. Number three, when you build drains, some drains belong to private sector and some belong to the local councils, right? So even as a private company, if you build as big a drain as you can, you tend to have a choke point with it. So what do we then do now, right? So two things. Number one, we need to work with the states, especially in Malaysia. So I commend the federal government for coming up with an adaptation policy. I think it's brilliant. We need to do it. It's progressive. But we need to make sure to implement it successfully. We need to start working very closely with the state governments. Why? The state governments typically have most of the authority when it comes to the use of land and water, right? We need to make sure there's alignment, there's no overlap, and there's understanding. Number two, a lot of the portion of the state government's revenue comes from land development. So the states, you don't blame them. They want to be able to develop land, right? But we need to be able to help them govern to find a balance for sustainable development. Number three, the councils, right? So some of us in the private sector have some excellent expertise, whether it's funding, research. We need to help the local councils do capacity building. So one simple example is if there's a development that's going to come, let's try to teach the councils how to do, for example, an environmental impact analysis. And then if that's very strong, then we can be part of mandating those approvals and why it needs to be done. We can also help the states to be able, or the councils to be able to secure funds for expansion of drains, flood walls. We realize sometimes the challenge is there. So the disconnect we feel between the state and the implementation level is there, and there's opportunities for us in the private sector to work directly with the states and the councils to be able to strengthen this. Charmaine.
Fantastic. Definitely one of the challenges we see, that mix between the different levels that we need to get involved to really make action happen. I think you're going to come at it from a different angle, Dr. Hafiz. So share one of the challenges you see.
Sure. I think we can cover this from what we think are the foundations that needs to be put in place in Malaysia, right? And the way we look at it is threefold. First is on the analysis part, second is on the planning, and third is on implementation and execution, right? From an analysis part, I think we need to go in with our eyes wide open, right? And what that means is that we need robust data. Yes, of course, we won't have enough data, but we just need to be directionally correct and iterate along the way as we go along, right? We need to have readily available and standardized data. For this, we commend the work done by GC3, the Joint Committee on Climate Change, Bank Negara and Securities Commission, as well as NARIM in putting together all the data that we have in Malaysia. But in addition to that, we also need a combination of not just historical data, but also projected data, right? And what that means is inclusion of IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change models, to predict what's going to happen in the future. So for example, 5 years ago, there may be areas in Malaysia that's never been flooded, but who knows what's going to happen 5 years from now, right? And so all that is to say that with that, we would have physical risk analysis and understand the vulnerability and the exposure of what we are dealing with, right? And from that, we can put a value on the impact and the cost of inaction, right? And I think those are critical pieces, which then, feeds into the next phase, which is the planning phase. And on planning phase, I think back to Satpal's point, and so also Anjali, coordination is critical here, right? We need to have public-private partnerships, and that's essential. And if you look at some of the efforts required on adaptation, there needs to be joint efforts put in place. Coastal adaptation, for example, right? We need to have the Drainage and Irrigation Department, the Research Center for National Hydraulics, Town and Country Planning Department, as well as different ministries and agencies to come together to solve some of these issues, right? And this can be facilitated, again, back to the National Adaptation Plan, and I can't stress how critical this is, right? And we look at countries such as South Korea and Japan who've had very robust adaptation plans in place, and I commend the work by the minister in putting this together, right? Philippines also announced theirs just recently at COP28, so great work there as well. So after we've done all this planning and coordination together, I think the next piece is on implementation. And oftentimes the question is, where would the funds come from, right? And on this, we need to mobilize the private, public, and also philanthropic sectors to come together and to provide funding for adaptation. And let's not also forget the international funding, right? The Green Climate Funds, the Adaptation Fund, right? And putting together funds for adaptation measures in Malaysia. And for this, we'd like to acknowledge our affiliated entity, Think City, who just secured $10 million for the Penang Adaptation Project, right? And so, after all that is done, the final piece of the puzzle is really execution. And I think on this, we do have technical expertise in Malaysia, but before any of that can happen, we need the three pieces I mentioned earlier. So first of all, data, coordination between private and public sector, and also the funding, mobilization of the funding, right? So I'll just stop there for now, Charmaine.
I'd say that was a pretty holistic answer. I think we've covered end to end, from where we are to how do you get to action. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Hafiz. And maybe Jean, we talked already, Anjali's given us some good examples of countries at the planning phase who, the Japans, the South Koreas who are really planning and actually taking it into action. I think you see the world, you see across the world on this topic a lot. So maybe you could share some things that you've seen that you think could be useful learnings for Malaysia.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So I'm going to take two examples. One is a more systematic approach to disaster risk finance and how to use contingent financing. And the other one is more related to flood insurance, and which is a very relevant topic in the context of Malaysia. So let's start with disaster risk finance. So one very good example, and you already mentioned the country, is what the Philippines have done. So they have really developed a very comprehensive and integrated approach to disaster risk finance, which meant policy reform, but also putting in place specific instruments to be able to have that financial protection that we discussed earlier. Contrary to Malaysia, I think the exposure to this kind of shocks is higher. So in the context of Malaysia, it's roughly 1% of GDP per year at the moment, which is still reasonable, but is only addressed through the budget. Whereas that's where the example of Philippines is interesting, is that you diversify the kind of instrument. So that means having a national level fund where you have budget allocation, but also CADDOs, so kind of catastrophic reaction tools, some of them providing liquidity post-typhoon to the government, so that element of financial protection, catastrophic bond, which is also a way to go to the market and leverage private capital, which in that case provided protection up to 225 million in case of earthquake, of tropical cyclones. But then what you see is that these contingent elements then have led to innovation in the market, in particular in terms of development of insurance market. And that's where come back to something that could be really interesting for Malaysia, where there is quite a bit of work still to be done. So we've seen that also in other contexts where the sovereign, after thinking of contingent financing, then thinks about insurance instrument that can be put in place. So this is something on which we see scope for more to be done in the context of Malaysia. Now, let me turn to flood risk and how to finance. We're actually finalizing a report with Malaysian authority, which hopefully we can make public soon. And what we see is that there is actually quite an underdeveloped market for flood insurance. And we've seen that in other regions. It links a lot with agri-insurance. So I'm going to take an example of work that we are doing in Africa at the moment. It's a regional project where we are targeting pastoralists, so really at the ground level. And part of it is to provide an integrated suite of financing instruments at the very ground level. So you have payment and saving accounts, index-based insurance, financial literacy. And the objective is really to link the pastoralists to market, and that way they can also mobilize more financing for their livestock value chain. And in 1 year, we've been able to provide protection to 1.1 million pastoralists. That means 170,000 policies. 70% of them are women-led households. So that's where we see the very ground level, community level support. And that led to $105 million in total sum insured, and the total insurance payout were $3.3 million to 70,000 payholders. So very practical result in just 1 year. So what we are trying to do at the moment is really to draw the lesson of that experience and see how it can replicate it in our country and then adapt it to the specific risk of the country. So 3 principles around that project, but can be relevant elsewhere. Risk layering at the household level. So delivery mechanism, digital transaction, savings for response to moderate shock, and then insurance for more severe shock. Second, in that case, regional implementation to bring economies of scale, which is less an issue in Malaysia, but shows that really having big enough a market is an important element. And finally, partnership, and in particular with new service provider to really go to the ground level, microfinance institution, insurance company, and now to mobilize agent network to be able to do that. So just to say that financial preparedness and protection is really important. Now, last comment, which is on SMEs, and where you need to think across somehow all the financial institutions. So in some countries are relying a lot on guarantees for loans to SMEs. And what we've seen in some countries is the ability to embed in that financial protection mechanism where you can have almost automatic response for some windows of partial guarantees so that you have disaster-related windows, and immediately through this innovative instrument, you can improve the financial situation of the affected firm. So we've done that in Burkina Faso and Rwanda, and we think this is part of the toolkit that can be brought to a more comprehensive and systematic approach to disaster risk finance.
Again, I'd say a pretty comprehensive answer. I hope whoever's doing the adaptation planning is thinking about these aspects and taking notes as Jean speaks there. I don't know if any of you were at the Hillary Clinton thing yesterday. You mentioned around the importance of protecting those at the coalface who are very often women, and the criticality of that. And she did say that we should speak out in any sessions like this and remind people that is where some of the protection needs to start around the world. But thank you, Jean. That was a fantastic answer to the question around challenges on the financial protection and disaster recovery perspective. I don't know if there are any other international examples, Angela. You've given us 2. I think they're fascinating as we think about Malaysia. Is there anything else you want to add there before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think just based on what the other panelists said, maybe one aspect that we should also be thinking about is on interregional risks, because I think in a lot of cases when you're sort of looking at physical risk, you're always looking at a country level or a local level, but it's really important, especially in Asia, because of the way that countries are so interconnected with each other in terms of resources, and also the way that disasters sort of impact countries across borders. It's really important to be able to coordinate at a country level, like across borders on how you're going to respond and how you're going to adapt to these physical risks jointly, because it shouldn't be the case that, one country sort of takes away resources from another to be able to sort of build resilience for your own borders, right? So I think there are already a few frameworks within the ASEAN forum where they've started thinking about the impact of disasters and how you could sort of respond jointly. There's also a South-South initiative to sort of build more coordination on climate, which I think is also a very promising way to sort of look at physical climate risks. And I think it's going to gain increasing importance, especially when you look at it from an investor perspective. Your company will sort of be also looking to build resilience on its supply chains. And a supply chain is not essentially sort of contained within a specific border. So you need to understand from an investor perspective how your company is able to sort of protect all of its supply chains that will be linked across borders. So it's not just an Asia issue, it's sort of like a global issue, and we need to sort of think about this at a much higher level as well.
Absolutely, and it's the sort of thing that the likes of a PepsiCo or whatever have to think about and are beginning to think about in a much more adaptation way, you know, and that's what we need as a world. We need these global companies that have global supply chains to start investing in adaptation and bringing private sector financing, which is where I'm going to go in a minute. But before we go there, back into the Malaysia, you know, within Malaysia, we all talk about this criticality of collaborating and integration across different layers of governance. But do we have any thoughts, and I'll start with you, Dr. Hafiz, around actually what can one do in Malaysia to ensure more integrated collaboration within the country to address adaptation? I understand that, you know, when there's an event, when there's a huge flood, everybody stops and sorts things out, but you know, that's not going to work. So going forward, so yes, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Thanks. So I think I can answer this from what Khazanah has done so far, right? And really coming back to the outcome, we want to have the companies include adaptation and resilience in the strategic planning, right? And the process is to be engaging the portfolio companies, understand what the issues, and have a very collaborative mindset in engaging them, right? And the approach is to use data. And with evidence-based, and this is absolutely critical, right? So the approach that we've taken is two-pronged. First of all, we've invested in a climate risk analysis, diagnostic in nature. So we systematically evaluate the climate risk of the portfolio companies. And again, data is critical, and because of that, we collaborated with a specialized climate advisory partner looking at 7 types of hazards. We've identified the key risks on our portfolio companies throughout Malaysia, and unsurprisingly, the result in 2050, 15% of our portfolio is deemed high risk, from mainly riverine flooding, soil movement, and extreme heat, right? And in fact, some of these assets are already at risk with a failure probability of 93% right now. So with that data, we bring to the table, engage with the portfolio companies. And one way we do this is, this year we started something called a sustainability circle, where we have all the portfolio companies, including Satpal as a representative from Plus, to come over and discuss what are the trends, the major challenges, how we can work together on sustainability matters, right? So a few weeks ago, in fact, we had a sustainability circle on adaptation and resilience. So what we did was we handed out essentially report cards to these companies to have a view on our level, what are the physical risks they are exposed to, right? But again, the angle is to initiate that conversation so that we can go through this process together, right? On that, and so next steps, we'll be working closely with the companies to deep dive, right? Understand exactly what are the physical climate risks they are facing with different types of assets, different locations across Malaysia, and also to ensure that they have strategic planning on adaptation resilience built in place. So that's kind of how we pull everyone together within the portfolio companies ecosystem to work together and address this issue, because, we need to all do this together, right? We can't do it by ourselves, so.
As the Minister said, it's a whole of society problem, and I think companies like yours, Khazanah, or sovereign wealth funds like yours, really have a role to play here. So it's wonderful to hear what you're doing in that regard. And Satpal, was there anything else you wanted to say around how we can ensure more integrated collaboration within the country on this topic?
Yeah, so thank you so much. I think we talked about the importance of a public-private partnership, collaborating with states, local council, but I think it's also important for us to talk about the people on the ground, right? We have to keep communication around climate change, adaptation, resilience, transition, relatable and simple. Now, the challenge I face is the depiction of, ice caps melting and, polar bears doesn't sound alarms in Southeast Asia. We have to make that content tailored towards. So when people think about climate change, they think about polar bears. But when they think about floods, they don't realize these are adaptation, resilience. So it's to localize the content and how it impacts, right? Number 2 is the difference it makes to people around us. So we're such an important conference. I spoke to one of the guys who was looking after security. I said, do you know what this conference is about? No idea, right? To be able to get that communication down on the ground is very important. Maybe a simple example I give you. I'm looking at this. We once had plastic water bottles at our management meetings. And then we said, no more water bottles, let's go with those glass containers. But we saw every now and then, we still started seeing these water bottles. So I went down on the ground to speak to the tea lady actually. And I said, why are you still having water bottles? Why are you still having plastic containers? She said, because I have to wash these water bottles. I don't have help. So to be able to just go down on the ground to understand what they actually need. So an education on the importance of, moving away from single-use plastic, how it may affect her daily life, and getting help for her changed it completely. So I think that's what we need to be able to do. So some of the big corporate words like, resilience, adaptation may not necessarily inspire action. So we need to make it mainstream and as relatable as possible to people on the ground, Shamin. Thank you for that.
Thank you for bringing us back to the ground. It's always an important perspective. Let's move on to financing. We've talked a bit about some of the financing that you talked about, Jean. But in terms of financing these adaptation measures that need to take place, and the minister talked about huge infrastructure projects and lots of other things which aren't necessarily infrastructure, investments in healthcare and all that sort of thing. We have 5 minutes, as that gentleman has just told us, so we're not going to spend so long on this, but just a few moments if we may. So bringing the private sector in, I think we all agree, as well as the international funding, and it sounds similarly as actually accessing some of that international funding quite effectively, which is not happening everywhere, I can tell you. But in terms of bringing the private sector in, maybe just a couple of sentences from you, Jean, around how we could do that, and then followed by you, Anjali.
Okay, so very quickly, a couple of sentences referring back to the study I mentioned on flood risk. What are we seeing? Those most affected are SMEs, so it's really important to be able to provide support. Second, financial institutions actually don't have enough information on flood risk to be able to price the risk, and therefore it limits the access to finance. What can the government do? One, provide much more information and data on the flood risk. They have that information, make it public. That's a way to inform the decision making, and that's a way also potentially to develop public-private partnership on financial protection. And the second element, I think it's already been alluded several times, is to make sure that through regulation as well as regulatory expectation, rebalancing from mitigation to adaptation, showing that adaptation is important and that it's also the role of the financial institution to provide finance in that context. More information contributes to that, and that's why I'm also mentioning the partial credit guarantee. That's also a way to signal that there are mechanisms put in place to arm those that are most in need in context of resilience, but also that they reduce their exposure to those risks.
So I think, this COP has been really eventful for adaptation, because I feel like what we are hearing, until last COP, was that there is no business case for the private finance to get involved in adaptation or resilience. But I think during this COP, what you're hearing in all forums that's discussing adaptation and resilience is that there is a definite business case for the private finance to get involved. And the reason is that the losses are going to be so huge. So if you invest in it early, you're guarding companies against those losses. You're guarding an entire economy against those losses. So I think that's been really encouraging to see. And I think what we're seeing, what the lessons that we've learned from the mitigation side, and that's also what we're hearing a lot from COP this year, is that it is policy that is really driving more finance to flow into mitigation in developed markets, in emerging markets. So I think that's also what we need to see for adaptation. We need to see a real commitment from governments to engage with the community, and we've sort of created some recommendations on how investors can be involved. I think there are some fundamental steps of having a common understanding of what the physical climate risk exposure for a country is. So creating a forum where you're able to sort of exchange that information on what is your analysis of the climate risk and what is my analysis, and can we sort of create a common understanding for us to work together to develop a pipeline of projects that the public sector and the private sector can work together to sort of innovate on financial solutions. I think that is fundamentally the way forward, and you need to sort of work towards creating these sort of forums that we're increasingly seeing in a lot of countries in Asia. We need to be able to see this interregionally and globally as well, but I think we're at a really good place from at least last COP in sort of discussing these solutions, and I think it's just about propelling these conversations and creating these forums and just stepping the pedal on it, basically.
Fully agree. That's exactly the way to move up the experience curve on adaptation. Okay, we're going to use our last 3 minutes, and this is a surprise question. I didn't prepare you for this one. I'd like each of you to share with the audience here the one thing you've learnt out of this panel that Malaysia could do better, more of, etc., to achieve the adaptation result that we all want to achieve. And I'll start with you, Satpal.
Thank you. Very quickly, I think we must start measuring the cost of inaction and cleanup. So the cleanup of landslides alone in Malaysia the last 5 years cost us 4 billion ringgit. So as companies go out there, when we start looking at business cases proposition, let's move away from ROI. Let's start talking about public perception, reputation, being a responsible organization, and focusing on public safety. I think that's very important for organizations out there.
Wonderful answer. Dr. Hafiz.
So I think we started this session with the question of why. Right? And I think as a nation, we need to be clear on why we are supporting this climate agenda. Right? I think we cannot just depend on developed countries to decarbonize to save us all. We need to save ourselves. And this requires a mindset shift, really, right? To think about adaptation as of equal importance, if not more important than mitigation, right? And to quote Robert Swan, the explorer, the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it, right? And I think not one party can actually do this alone. We need to win this battle together. So let's get together, collaborate, and solve this problem together.
That was a cheat answer, but I do like it. It wasn't something you learned from the panel, but it was a great answer. Jean.
So, my colleagues on the panel know much better about Malaysia than I do, and I think what I really like in the discussion is, one, we all agree that adaptation and resilience is essential, but also how to customize what we've learned elsewhere to a very specific context. And I think all of you brought that very specific, unique features of Malaysia, and then how do we use what we know works in that specific context. So I've learned a lot from the discussion on that, and I think that's also an agenda for action in partnership, which is what we need to do even more on adaptation.
Another wonderful answer. I feel that is the World Bank way of working as well. But,
I feel like the way that the session was put together was done really well, like where we got the minister to talk about the policy level support that's, going to support all of this action on adaptation, and then you followed it up with like the private sector, finance, the MDBs and, private sector investors. What are you going to do? I think it's just come together really well, and the message is sort of clear for everyone on what Malaysia needs to do and how we're going to do it. So I think it's just come together really well, and I don't need to sort of add more to that.
Thank you. Wonderful panel. Lovely discussion. Thank you for listening to us.